Good afternoon, committee. Just to start the meeting with notification of the appointment of the chair and vice chair of the Children and Young People's Committee. At the meeting of the Council on the 19th of May 2026, members were pleased to appoint Councillor Edna Murphy as Chair of the Committee and Councillor Johnny Edge as Vice Chair for the municipal year of 2026-2027. I'll now hand over to Councillor Murphy.
Thank you very much. So I'd like to begin by welcoming those members of the press and public who've joined us today. The County Council allows filming and photography at its public meetings, so feel free to take pictures or share on social media during the meeting. Please, though, can everyone present turn their phones to silent or vibrate whilst the meeting is taking place? There's no fire alarm tests scheduled for today, so if the fire alarm sounds, I will adjourn the meeting and we will leave the room by the side doors and use the external fire exit to the assembly point in the car park. I would remind everyone present that the meeting will be live streamed and a recording will be placed on the Council's website. The meeting will be adjourned every 2 hours for a short comfort break. Please welcome Councillor Julie Kerr to the committee, who's replacing Councillor Ian Manning, and Councillor Chris Thornhill, who replaces former Councillor James Sidlow. So item 2 is apologies for absence and declarations of interest. Would the Democratic Services Officer please report any apologies?
Apologies received from Councillor James Stewart, substituted by Councillor Robin Wyatt, John Young, Kate Pereira, and also I've received, I know that Councillor Damry Homan's going to be slightly late, but he will be here soon.
Thank you very much. Yes.
Just to declare an interest, I'm a county councillor for Somersham and Erith, which covers the Wheatsheaf Crossroads.
Thank you very much for that. You beat me to it because I was going to ask people to ask members to declare if they wanted to declare any disclosable pecuniary interest or non-statutory disclosable interest. We've had yours, thank you very much. Any others? No, thank you very much. And of course, it's always possible to make a declaration of interest at any point during the meeting. So don't hesitate if that's the case. So the next item is to look at the minutes of the meeting on the 21st of April. Does everyone agree that it's an accurate record? Or are there any points of disagreement? No, I'll take that as an accurate, everyone agreeing to it being an accurate record. Thank you. An updated minutes action log was included in the papers. Are there any questions about it? No, thank you. We'll take the minutes action log as noted. So the next item on the agenda is public questions and petitions. We have received one public question in relation to item 5, the next item on the report. So we'll take the question then, if that's acceptable. So we have no one present to ask a question. Okay, thank you.
So we have a question received from Miss Day. The local SEND reform plan states that success will be reflected in improved attendance, participation, progress, preparation for adulthood, a stronger sense of belonging and greater confidence among families. What measures will the council use to determine whether children, young people and families are actually experiencing those improved outcomes?
Thank you very much. It's an excellent question, and Ms. Day will have a written response within 10 working days of the meeting. May we now move to the report, item 5. Sorry? Oh, I'm sorry. Councillor Girls.
Can sitting members be copied on that response, please?
Yes, of course.
Thank you.
Thank you. As a matter of interest, I think we normally do that.
The response to the question is included in the minutes of the meeting as an appendices.
Well, we'll make sure it is received by everyone. Thank you. Item 5 on the agenda, inclusion for all the Department for Education SEND reform plan. We have Sarah Callaghan and Michael Bateman to introduce this report. Members will note that the final SEND reform plan that was submitted to the Department for Education on Friday the 19th of June was circulated to members on the same date and uploaded to the meeting page. Would you like to present your paper? Thank you.
Yes, thank you, and good afternoon, everybody. So just to clarify, the report committee published a week ago contained the cover report and a copy of the draft SEND reform plan to the DFE, i.e. the draft that was submitted on the 19th of May, and the final SEND reform plan that was submitted to the DFE last Friday, the 19th of June, in line with the national timeline, is included in the agenda pack as an appendix. So just so that you're clear, because at the point that we had to submit the papers, we were still finalising the draft, but you do have as an appendix the final draft report. So committee is asked to note the progress in co-producing a SEND reform plan in line with the guidance set out by the DFE, and it's fair to say that the timescales prescribed by the DFE were quite tight. The white paper was published on the 26th of February, and we had to submit our first draft that had to be co-produced by the 19th of May, and the final plan by the 19th of June. So the plan sets out how Cambridgeshire will move from a reactive SEND system to an inclusive early intervention model. Focus is on more children supported in mainstream settings with specialist help brought into schools through our team around the school model that responds to the experts at hands funding that was introduced as part of the white paper reforms. It aims to improve outcomes and the lived experience for children and families, build confidence in the system, picking up on the question that was just posed. We have included parental confidence within the submitted plan. It also aims to stabilise SEND finances and reduce reliance on high-cost placements by intervening earlier. So the key reforms, the things that will change, are earlier support without waiting for diagnosis, reducing escalation to crisis. So the whole principle on which this is predicated is about putting in place earlier support so that children are not subject to significant delays. It introduces the experts at hand model, which is about schools accessing multidisciplinary specialists, example, educational psychologists, speech and language therapists, occupational therapists, more easily, earlier, and on a locality footprint. It talks about the expansion of local provision. So we've talked previously about our enhanced resource bases that provide support on a mainstream school site to that specialist support that some children require to enable them to access education, but keeps them in their local mainstream school. It also focuses on stronger partnership working across the council, health, schools, and critically parents and carers. So some key dates, the plan was submitted in time with the prescribed DFE process on Friday, 19th of June. In autumn 2026, implementation begins at scale, including service redesign and locality partnerships. So we've been through our education redesign that very much reflects the principles articulated in the white paper. By September 2026, the government will communicate their plan approval. And then the high needs stability grant payment, if our plan is approved, will be released. So there will be quarterly oversight, formal monitoring with the Department for Education and NHS England. And this is a 3-year transformation plan, so covers 2026 to 2029. So the year 1 focus really talks about improving our education, health and care plan timeliness and reducing delayed plans, reducing waiting times for children with autistic spectrum conditions, rolling out our early concerns model, which is an integrated early response that brings services to meet the needs in a collaborative way for children requiring additional support, and a focus on expanding our mainstream inclusion, which I've talked about in terms of the specialist bases. And also it will be looking at establishing our cluster locality partnerships in our team around the school model in response to the experts at hand references within the white paper. So year 1 will be very much about stabilising the system, reducing immediate pressures, and then year 2 we will look to embed our new models and expand provision. And then year 3 will focus on delivering a preventative, inclusive and financially sustainable system. So this is a mandatory national reform programme with strong DfE oversight, and success depends upon delivering earlier intervention, stronger mainstream inclusion and financial sustainability. So approval of the plan is critical to securing funding and financial support through the High Needs Stability Grant that I've referenced, but also through the Experts at Hand funding. So I'll pause there to take questions. I don't know, Michael, did you want to draw out anything that I've not made reference to specifically?
Thanks, Sarah. Afternoon, everyone. I think just very briefly to point out that, as Sarah said, that because this is prescribed through the DfE, the report that you've got is very much a DfE template. And therefore, I just think it's worthwhile pointing out for yourselves and members of the public that the 50-page plan, the submission, because the actual plan starts on around about page 26. Prior to that is the DfE context and guidance. So that the full plan is that 50-page plan that we've co-produced with very specific prescribed word count from the DfE. And whilst that sounds very processy, it's just pointing it out because, as you can imagine, when you're co-producing a plan with partners, getting everyone's feedback, trying to make sure that that's captured and then responding to the initial advice we had from the DfE. We have achieved that. We have co-produced this plan fully, but it's within the context of those prescribed constraints through this template, which is understandable because the DfE and NHS England have to then review it on a basis across everyone. So that's that aspect. And also throughout the plan that we've submitted to the DfE and NHS England, we want to remind them and make it clear, and this is probably true in most local areas, or it certainly should be, that we already have an improvement plan. Inclusion for All is our improvement plan. It incorporated the Ofsted actions, the 5 areas for priority last year that we've been reporting here and elsewhere. And the Inclusion for All programme will continue and incorporate this SEND reform plan. And we think that's really important for everyone to understand, because otherwise it can sound very complex. So once we've had this approved through the DfE, through the channels that Sarah's outlined, we can then talk again about Inclusion for All, because it will incorporate this plan. So rather than people feeling we've got 2 or 3 separate plans, I think that's really important for people to understand. Thank you.
Thank you indeed. I think that's a really helpful clarification and context. Questions, comments from members? Yeah. Councillor Lowe.
Thank you. What's the impact of having to write this plan having on the day-to-day work?
Sorry. I think it's fair to say that the focus across the service at the moment is quite intense because we've obviously had to work to quite a tight timeline in terms of producing the plan, although the majority of that, as Michael's just alluded to, has been drawn from our existing plans. You know, we had the inspection back in January 2025. We had an action plan in response to that, and we'd already agreed Inclusion for All as our framework for improvement. So really it was about working with our partners to articulate our improvement journey in the format prescribed by the DfE. So it wasn't about starting from scratch. It was also about triangulating, you know, what we're aiming to do with the financial impact and the outcome measures. Alongside that, we know that we've been through the education redesign to ensure that we've got sufficient capacity in the right places across the service. And we've also been implementing our new early years and education system so that we'll have more confidence in the data and the financial projections arising from that. So there is a lot going on across the service, but I think what we welcome is the fact that the ambitions within the plan very much reflect our direction of travel, and that the redesign will enable us to get there more quickly because we've been able to put in additional capacity. So although there is pressure on the service, I think the positives are that we've been able to respond in a way that increases that capacity and gives a very clear vision that is supported nationally. So I don't know if there's anything you wanted to add there, Michael.
Maybe I'm extrapolating beyond the question in terms of the work that it takes to create this. And we've already talked about quarterly reporting, regular reporting back to the DfE. So also just to say that we welcome the fact that within the experts at hand additional funding guidance from government, a percentage of that is to be used for the implementation of the plan and the reporting. So government have recognised that there is a additional burden on the council, on officers in terms of leading that work. So if I anticipate some of what was possibly behind the question as well, the in addition to this being a positive thing for the service, the partnership having to come together at speed and co-produce this plan is what we've achieved. But the fact that there is that very understandable high level of scrutiny from central government throughout the 3 year of the plan on a quarterly basis, there is some additional funding for us to be able to have people that can do that so that it doesn't take away from our operational teams.
Councillor Goodliffe.
Thank you. I have 3 questions, Chair. Is it all right to take them separately? Yeah, brilliant. So you've talked about the plan and the government restrictions on word count, but obviously there are a lot of words in these 81 pages. Across all of this, we don't have any tangible key performance data. There's not baselines other than the HCP timeliness. Inclusion for All as a plan has some great ideas and ambition, but again, we still don't have the data we've asked for as a committee in terms of key performance indicators and regular reporting. It's been the plan for the council since November 2024. And we're not seeing sets of targets, baselines, timescales for change, or any ongoing data. I don't think waiting for SEND reform by the government is good enough. We should be seeing the impact of Inclusion for All programme already, and I'm not convinced we are. There are a number of key points where we're not getting this right for children in Cambridgeshire. So the educational health care needs assessment delays is obviously one of them. The lack of timeliness in reviews and support, more on this in my second question. The lack of collaborative working with our schools and settings to ensure they're financially able to support our children with SEND. Again, more on this in my third question. The lack of key staff. Yes, educational psychologists are a national issue, but our caseloads in Cambridgeshire for our caseworkers as of April were around 500 compared to a 200 average for the Eastern region. Do you feel that with this plan, with Inclusion for All and the current performance, that Cambridgeshire County Council are delivering the best education for children and young people with SEND?
Thank you. So there's a lot in there, and I think we'll probably do a collaborative response. Thank you, Councillor Goodliff. So yes, the Inclusion for All has been in place for a while, and I think it's fair to say that the scale of the demand has put some pressure in terms of how quickly we may have wanted to improve. But to come to your specific questions around EHCP delays, for instance, what we do know is that we've moved from the latter part of June 2025, from having typically around 150 requests for plans a month and the capacity to manage around 35. We now are able to manage around 100 of those requests. So there's still a gap, but because of the pledge, the committee pledging an additional funding of 780,000 in October, we've been able to bridge that gap and improve our performance. The reason why that is not impacting on the KPI for the 20-week assessments as significantly as it could is because obviously the delayed plans that are out of timescale are not going to then be reflected in that percentage towards the 20 weeks. So I think there is demonstrable improvements in terms of the level of capacity to support those children who are subject to delays. We've also coming to your question about the engagement with schools. Because of those delayed plans, we're working very closely with our schools, and we've actually got one of our special heads who is a Ofsted inspector and leads our special heads network, who's working closely with us to audit all of those backlog delayed plans, looking at the level of need, looking at the significance of that need, looking at the percentage of plans as an overall percentage of numbers on roll at individual schools, so that we've got an equitable process to manage those delays. So we're obviously balancing the new requests alongside a clear prioritisation of risk around those delayed plans. And I think that illustrates that we're working closely with our schools and settings around that. A further thing that we've developed with our schools and settings, recognising the pressure on them also, is we've developed a mainstream top-up fund, and the basis of that mainstream top-up will allocate funding to schools that are subject to significant delays on the basis of that prioritisation. So i.e. linked to the complexity of need, the percentage of delays for a particular school. So again, that is working directly with our schools to ensure that there is an equitable process that prioritises need. That you talked about the case loads and the comparison with the Eastern region. And I think through our education redesign that preempted the DFE white paper, we are adding an additional 11 full-time equivalent assistant caseworkers plus two full-time caseworkers that will aim to alleviate the workload on our caseworkers. And just finally and before Michael can give us more detail on the KPIs that are included in the SEND reform plan, but just in terms of your direct question around waiting for a blueprint nationally. I don't think we have waited for a blueprint nationally. Inclusion for All preempted the DFE white paper, and it was very much predicated on that earlier support. And our restructure is predicated on a team around the school model, which again preempted the experts at hand model, which very closely aligns to it, i.e. it's about bringing the right services on a locality footprint to work more closely with our schools. And just on that, in terms of the engagement with schools, I met with one of our clusters of schools last week, and they have a cluster that spans primary, special, secondary, as well as different status of schools, academies and maintained schools. and we are working collaboratively to define the bit in the middle. So those children who don't necessarily function well all the time in mainstream, but don't quite fit the level of need for specialist support. So we are trialling with them our rollout of the team around the school. So I think although schools are rightly frustrated because the system in terms of SEND is very difficult for schools, for parents, carers, for the local authority, I think that we are aiming to address that together. But I think on the specifics in terms of the KPIs that are included within the plan, Michael, could you expand on those?
Yeah, so we've acknowledged to the DFE, and we've mentioned this here before about the data issues that we've had that have enabled us, or rather not enabled us previously, to have that full update in there. So page 72 of the appendices, so of the sort of standalone plan, that's where DFE ask us to set out high-level summary about certain KPIs, and we've illustrated there those ones from Inclusion for All that we've had previously. However, there is a significant finance and data appendix that went into the DFE with this that they'll be checking over the summer, and that's something that we'll be then using here because the quarterly reporting back to the DFE will be across those. All of that data and finance, not just the narrative. It'll be about that sort of forensic impact. So that's something that we can be confident about bringing you here in the way we haven't previously, because there is literally a requirement for us to do that through the DFE. What's enabled us to do that is that the data cleansing issues that we've had, the data issues that we've had historically, which have meant that the annual statistical return to the DFE SEN2 that is used for this particular part of our work has always been compromised, and this year we've been able to get that to a better state because of the work that's been going into that, and also because of the requirement with this reform plan to have very detailed finance and other data metrics that all parts of the country will be measured on. Colleagues working us with that from data and finance teams have put effort into that to make sure that this was ready. And we've also this month had the go live of the EYES case management system, which we've also referenced before, which will assist greatly with far better reporting. Now, we mention that carefully because it's a big undertaking to implement that and make sure that data quality issues won't transform overnight just because we've got a new case management system. There's a requirement to make sure that how this is used by staff means that it gives us good reporting. So if we haven't been so explicitly honest in recent times here that I thought maybe we had, then I'll say that very clearly, that we have acknowledged significant data issues that we've had before that have meant that we haven't been providing those update on the baselines. We can say confidently that when I say future reporting, from sort of September onwards, because that's when we're going to have the feedback from the DFE, we will be able to provide that as part of the programme. And it won't just be those original ones that were the Inclusion for All ones. It'll be those plus the ones that we've put into the plan. So I think from a data and a baseline, counting the metrics and looking at impact through those indicators, but also, as we've said in the plan, other measures of measuring confidence that families should have increasingly, reducing complaints, reducing the feeling that parents need to use the tribunal system, etc. Those metrics, as well as sort of other hard metrics about performance that we need to include. So I think we all acknowledge that data has not been there in the previous reporting. There's been other spotlights that we've provided. EHCP, we've always given rich data on that, but all of the other indicators, we are confident that we can do that now because we've had to sort of galvanise all the different effort to get it in for this plan, and we'll now need to maintain that on a quarterly basis.
I just wanted to add. Oh, sorry, Councillor Goodliffe. On the draft plan that is within the pack, on page 101 in the pack, the data the KPIs are listed there, but the data isn't against them. But in the appendix, which, you know, when I said at the start, the appendix is the final submission, the data is in that final submission.
Thank you. So before a school applies for an educational healthcare needs assessment, they have to demonstrate that they've carried out ordinarily available provision, so SEND support for that child, and that they've then had a graduated approach of support used with assessments and plans and reviews, and then evidence that the outcomes of these additional interventions haven't resulted in adequate progress of the child, and then obviously they apply for an EHCP. When that EHCP is delayed, the school continues to support the child's needs in full through specialist intervention, teaching assistant hours, alternative provision, whatever is needed for that child. I know of cases where the cost of this results not only in loss of education to that child, but has an impact on the school as a whole, including budgetary pressures, but also an impact on other students within their peer group, their class. Additional specialist support cannot take place, such as speech and language for that child, while we're waiting for that EHCP to be issued. I know of cases where schools can estimate the financial impact alone for one child being over £44,000, where they've experienced over a year's delay between a request and the late issue of it in the NEHCP, which has gone unfunded. I know you've talked about top-up funding, but what we're not seeing across the board is backdated EHCP funds to that 20-week point at which a plan should have been issued. It feels like it's, in some cases, top-up funding is given. There is no actual process where schools can apply for interim funding whilst waiting for those delayed plans, not that is across the board. And as our current data shows that 93.33% of EHCPs are issued over 20 weeks, that 868 children are waiting for their delayed plan, and that the median delay is 330 days, arguably a whole academic year of education. Why are we using these delays in our process? It seems as a money-saving exercise, and has any air quality impact assessment upon schools, children and their educational impact been carried out?
Okay, so we haven't done an EQIA on that particular aspect. So just to answer that straight off the bat, no, we haven't. However, I can also, as quickly and assertively, also say that we definitely do not use this as a tactic to not provide funding. The team are not producing EHCPs on time, as recognised in the Ofsted report last year, and the backlog is there because of the capacity issues that we've talked about here, and that Sarah's mentioned in terms of us mitigating those through the education redesign. So no one in my teams would do that in terms of a money-saving reason. That is absolutely not the case. So I can say that very, very clearly. Sarah alluded to it earlier, but let me be more explicit. And we touched on this with some questions that we had when we were talking about EHCP here in April. So we have been developing with schools and had talked to the schools forum about a way of trying to mitigate some of the risks that you set out, which we completely acknowledge. There's nothing that you've said that I would disagree with in terms of all of those factors. And the plan that we have, very much ready to roll very soon. Communications are planned to all schools for this. Is a model where, and we've been very clear with certain school briefings we've done recently, that this is to provide some funding to some schools in certain circumstances, not all schools in all circumstances. So again, just need to be honest about how we're looking to do that. So the idea is that we will have a certain set of proxy indicators that allude to the kind of things you've mentioned, the prevalence of SEN in particular schools. Now, this can sound rather arbitrary, but it's a way of trying to provide some initial objectivity and so we can get some money flowing to some schools. So it will provide that list of all schools, and then we'll know the secondary schools and the primary schools that have got most financial risk at the moment on those indicators, so that we can provide some funding, looking at initially that 50% of the average top-up rate, knowing that when the plan is finalised, that will then come in at 100%. So the plan is that this would we would run that model twice a year. So the plan is that those schools that we've identified will be notified before the end of term, so that they'll at least have some notice before the end of term that there is that funding coming. It's essentially paying sort of 2 terms in advance and acknowledging that during that period there will be a change, because As Sarah said, a year ago we were issuing only 35 plans a month. We're now doing on average 100. So as plans are finalised, then the formula funding stops, and the specific funding to the child then continues. And also what we've identified, because that provides a kind of, as with anything like this, any formula, it provides a line where there are schools that side or this side of the line. So we're looking at 30 schools around the county totally that would be able to, that would benefit from this approach. But we've also recognised the fact that for those schools where the 52 weeks late, the 18 months late, those excessively late plans, regardless of where they would be coming on that kind of, for want of a better phrase, that leaderboard of where the formula takes them, that we would look to be able to provide funding in those circumstances, just to acknowledge that whilst we keep the efforts to make sure that we get the backlog down and more of the plans are done on time. So that it acknowledges exactly the point you've said. It's taken longer than we wanted to get that final model ready. And as we've been saying with some primary head teachers, we were briefing recently about this, and I was briefing school business managers last week about these approaches. We recognise that it's not for everyone in all circumstances, it's for some in certain circumstances, and it has to happen alongside the EHCP and performance improvement. So it's acknowledging that whilst we're doing that, there needs to be some funding that can flow, all from within the high needs block.
I just wanted to add two quick things to what Michael's just said also, that in terms of the EQIA, as Michael said, we haven't triggered an EQIA, but we have had that prioritisation process in place for some time. So where plans are delayed, where they are children looked after, children with tier 4 complex health needs, or are open to social care, they have been prioritised. And the other bit I just want to say in context of that risk management, the other thing to come out of the white paper is the notion of a vulnerable children's list. And we are working with our virtual school to develop that vulnerable children's list, whereby, because you made specific reference to children being out of school. So where there's children who are represented in our elective home education or waiting for a specialist placement and are not accessing their statutory entitlement to education, we are building that profile so that we can have a targeted response to support them. And we already look at the profile in terms of elective home education, where obviously there are children with SEND. So just to give, to add to, the process in terms of support to children with additional risks.
Thank you. I have to say 30 schools out of the 250 we have across the county is a very small number, and I would like to see us go back to funding needs assessment to the 20-week date that it should have been done by. My final question is around transition points and children who already have an education, health and care plan. Obviously, there is a legal duty for a final amended EHCP plan, EHCP, to be issued with a new setting named within it by the 15th of February for every Year 6 child who has an EHCP as set out by the 2015 Code of Practice and the 2014 SEND regulations. I've spoken to parents in May this year who had no name provision for their child to attend post-16, couldn't work with their young person to ensure transition as no such place was named. I also ask, as a school in my division has 8 such students with EHCPs, and none of them have had a transition EHCP or any EHCP in this academic year issued. And all of the parents from that school have been told it can wait until they are already in Year 7 and will be carried out then, i.e. after the transition, without any review of the support needed for the child to be successful in the change from primary to secondary, no assessment of the changes that will occur for this child, these children, and the impact this may have on their needs and support required, and no input from parents, current staff, the child themselves, specialists, nor the secondary school themselves to ensure a smooth transition. How many of these transitional EHCP reviews were issued in time this year? How many are still outstanding as we enter the last few weeks of this academic year? And what are the equivalent numbers for early years to reception, primary to secondary and post-16 transition, please.
Okay, so in terms of the deadline timescales, so transfer from year 6 through to year 7, and also then from secondary into post-16, on those 2 different dates, because February, mid-February is the deadline date for transfer from primary to secondary, and 31st of March for the deadline into post-16. So at those 2 particular points in the year, we were around the 45% mark for those 2 cohorts by those deadline dates. So half had been done by the February transfer, half had been done by March for the post-16 cohort at that point in time. My understanding is that 100% of all of the reviews had taken place in the school, that we then are in receipt of those reviews, because it's then our job. So the schools and settings do those reviews. They come into us, and then our job is to make sure we reflect on those, if there are any major changes or not. And then even if no major changes, we have to at very least name the new setting for having done those consultations ahead of September start. So when I talk about the 45% done by those 2 statutory deadlines, that's what it relates to. So it's an acknowledgement that schools have done their part by holding the review and have submitted in, and then we have to do the next day. Sorry, slight caveat, because we did this in the April report, didn't we? That there were some reviews that we were chasing up schools around about that Easter time. But my point about 100% of schools do the reviews is, I don't doubt that they did the reviews, but had they been received into us, so we were checking those. I'll be honest, I don't know, as we sit here today, the latest figures on where we've carried on those backlog, because as we set out in the April plan, there were a large number of those plans where we had carried out the proposal, so they didn't count to be finalised, of course. So I couldn't say that was 70% done when we were here last time around, because it's not until they're finalised that we can do that. The majority of those had been sent out to parents and other schools for the consult with those proposed, so parents should know where they're going. I will make sure that I get those figures, because, as you say, the clock is ticking down to the end of term. And certainly if you've got schools where 100% have not been done, when I knew that on February it was 50%, March it was 50% for the other cohort, 2 totally separate cohorts, just so you know, I'm not using 50% twice or averaging up to 50%. So I will double check those figures, and just to be clear, we collect those because of that particular phase transfer 6 to 7, and then into post-16, but you're also asking for early years into reception as well. Okay, well, I'll have to check those figures separately. I don't have those similar figures in my mind about where we were with the statutory deadlines. But yeah, I acknowledge the point, which is families going into the summer break, knowing where they're going. And we propose, we consult with settings, and they, on the whole, should say that they can meet needs and let us know if there are reasonable adjustments that are needed for taking the child. If there's a technical finalisation of us issuing a plan with the name after the event, but everyone knows where the child is going and there's no issue about that, that's one thing I would be very concerned about. If people don't know where their children are going ready for September, that would concern me for understandable reasons. So I'll get the latest figures, but particularly check that status if we've got families that don't yet know where their children are going for September. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Councillor Edge.
Thank you. Sorry, it's a fast way typing. I've got a couple of quick questions as well. First one's actually just to thank you for all the work that you've done on this, because I think it was a lot to do in a really short time, and I think you've done a sterling job pulling it all together. However, I just want to kind of gauge, because obviously I think this is a really, really important plan going forward, as we all know. I mean, I think the biggest financial outcome of it is getting hopefully getting rid of the safety valve on the high needs block deficit. So really critical. It's kind of assuming that everything's going to kind of plough forward in September, but that is surely on the basis of the DFE confirming the plan. So my first question is really how certain are we? What confidence levels do we have that the plan is likely to be accepted?
So we had to submit the draft on the 19th of May, and we have an allocated DFE advisor from a SEND perspective, but also from a finance perspective. And the feedback we received was that the plan met the criteria, but some elements were full and some elements were partial. So then obviously between May 19th and June 19th, we then looked to improve the level of detail on those elements that were seen to be partial. But I think I have had chance to look at other plans, and I feel that that both from the DFE advisors and from our conversations with colleagues in other areas, I do feel that we have submitted a robust plan. That has certainly been the feedback. I think picking up on Councillor Goodliffe's challenge, I think we've been quite transparent about the level of improvement that we need to see. And that's why the triangulation of the data and the finances and the outcomes is critical, and that regular scrutiny then that we would welcome from committee is critical to the implementation. So I hope that answers your question. Thank you.
Thank you. So my other question probably slightly kind of touches on the public question to a certain extent. So the plan talks about inclusive voice, which is already covered as part of our Inclusion for All programme. I appreciate when you kind of read further into it, it does suggest that this is it is co-production that we're talking about here with wider stakeholders, including parents and children and young people, but not treating it as a separate consultation. I just really want to understand what work went in that co-production through the production of this plan, really, before submission.
So I will start. So we felt it was critically important to reflect the voice of parent and carers. Obviously, the timeline was prescribed by the DFE and was quite tight. So we had 2 discrete sessions with our parent carer forum, and then we had a partnership event on the 27th of April, which engaged with the Integrated Care Board, representatives with our schools, and with our commission services, and obviously the Parent Carer Forum, to ensure that what we were presenting reflected their position, because the first thing we had to do was to self-assess ourselves against the locality maturity assessment tool that the DFE shared as part of this process. So it's fair to say, however, that not all parents and carers engage through the Parent Carer Forum. So we're also, through our Inclusive Voices strand of Inclusion for All, we are looking to identify through all those children that have a plan and those children that have SEND support, what are our mechanisms of engagement more extensively. So those parents and carers who don't necessarily engage with the Parent Carer Forum. So using our schools and looking at other opportunities to ensure that that is a fair and representative voice within the plan. So I think in terms of how the draft plan that we submitted, it did reflect the application of that self-assessment from our partners. So there were 7 pillars within it that we had to judge ourselves. And we found that in 5 areas we were emerging, and in 2 areas we were a little bit further on and perceived ourselves to be developing. And that then obviously shaped the prioritisation within the SEND reform plan itself. So it was absolutely a partnership endeavour, but there's probably more detail that you could add, perhaps, Michael.
I suppose I would just say that it's important that we keep moving forward on business as usual, where we're engaging, and And there's a danger, isn't there, sometimes with these kind of things, that they're in a bit of an event. You know, we have to put a plan together within a particular time scale around this. And the work just never stops, really, in terms of trying to make sure that you're engaging colleagues, partners, stakeholders, call them what you like. It's everyone here in Cambridgeshire who's got an interest in special educational needs, alternative provision, inclusion in all of its ways. You know, yesterday, Pinpoint were holding again their regular partnership forum. Not too many people attended online, but those that did, we spent, you know, a good over an hour just talking about how things are there on the ground for them. I was there to listen and hear, and there were significant themes that you see mirrored here coming through. But there was also a theme around young carers and the impact there on young carers and or with siblings who have got special educational needs, etc., and having to reflect on, so how do we do that in a meaningful way in the plan. Voiceability, regularly feeding back young people with complex needs through the post-16s transition group that is hosted very regularly. They always present so well the work that they're doing. Young people themselves with learning disabilities who are part of that work, meeting other young people in our special schools and in community spaces, and feeding back what can you do from a post-16 point transition that is meaningful. But also they take that message out sort of on our behalf as well, because they're the best people to do it. It's all those things that build up, which is how we need to keep that in mind. And as Sarah said, you know, using schools, recognizing that, you know, earlier setting schools and colleges have got that direct contact with children and young people far more than we do, and we need to trust the feedback we're getting through them as well, and also challenge that. And I think one of the key things that we wanted to do through the redesign of the services that Sarah's mentioned, and the reforms afford us the ability to do it quicker and faster and better, is the establishment of those locality partnerships, building on the school clusters and other locality working that health already have. Because that's the best way to make a reality of when we say we're going to capture voice. What do we really mean by that? Well, there's the feedback from all the people working in that particular locality of the county, and we can adjust our team around the school to say, well, this is what we're hearing. And sometimes it doesn't need to be scientific. And I just think it's all of those things that we need to constantly remind ourselves of. And maybe I'm saying it out loud to remind myself as well, that that's what we need to do. But that's what we do sometimes without even thinking about it. It's just what we do in these kind of jobs.
Thank you very much. Councillor Martin, then Councillor Goldsack.
Thank you very much, Chair. I've got a couple of questions as well, if you'll indulge me. But to start off with, just to the point that Councillor Goodliff raised at the end, I've had similar experiences, not just within my division, but through my day job working for the local MP. When we go and meet schools and we speak to Senkos, they raise the same issue. And there was an example I raised with Martin a couple of meetings ago, where there was a school that had a student going from early years into primary that was 5 years out of date. And the needs has obviously changed in that period of time and caused a lot of issues for them. So I know that there's other examples of similar weights as well. So if we can get that data on the delays as well, so not just how many you're completing on time, but what are the delays that you're experiencing? Are we looking at predominantly over a year, under a year, etc.? It'd be useful to understand and recognise that. I just want to touch on the financial exposure of this transition, because we know coming down the line after this plan is approved that we're going to see the stability grants that's going to pay circa 90%. And obviously at that stage, we'll find out how the other 10% is going to be financed. But what financial mitigations have we got in place to ensure that running both services at the same time, which is likely going to be the case for 3 years, isn't going to outstrip the money that we've got put to one side and that we're using to finance this transition and this service? But also, once the transition is complete, what safeguards are in place in case the ISP model outpaces our current performance and our current costings? Because hopefully ISPs will be significantly quicker to enact than the EHC process that we're currently going through, and therefore the cost to the council is likely to be significantly increased compared to the 1,800 backlog that we currently have, where no funding is going out to those students?
So it'll probably be, again, a bit of a collaborative response. So in terms of the stability grant that you made reference to, so yes, if subject to the approval of our plan, we would receive 90% of the cumulative deficit within the dedicated schools grant. So the issue with that is that if the demand, and I think that's what you're describing, if the demand continues at its current level, then despite that funding, we will quickly go back into deficit. So I think that the plan has to do two things in parallel. It has to work with schools and settings to meet need earlier, and the reference to the individual support plans, which are plans that have been will be introduced as part of the SEND reforms, is to operate at that targeted plus level. So the white paper talks about the education, health and care plans being reserved for the most specialist needs, and that the approach will be universal, targeted plus specialist, and the individual support plans will fit in that targeted and targeted plus area. And that becomes the remit for schools, similar to how it was when they had School Action Plus. So there is a need to ensure through the implementation of the team around the school experts at hand approach to enable schools to manage need at that targeted plus level. They need to have access to those services at an earlier point, because otherwise the demand remains the same for the education, health and care plans. So I think it has to be, so yes, we welcome the additional funding through the stability grant. However, without concerted effort across the system, so that's the council working in partnership with schools and wider services, our speech and language therapists, occupational therapists, our educational psychologists, our specialist teachers, without a concerted effort to work earlier with our schools to support them so that they can manage need at that targeted plus level, then the demand will not reduce. So I think there is a challenge there, but it is obviously about ensuring that through the implementation of that team around the school, that we are working closely with schools to understand the needs that they are really finding it challenging to meet. And I think going back to what I was saying earlier, we are working on a test and learn basis with established clusters of schools to say, well, what's the bit in the middle? Who are the children who can be in mainstream but become dysregulated and need some additional support to stay there? And what does that look like? And where does it come from? And then who are the children that will still require specialist support, and how do we facilitate and ensure that they get that? Do you want to sort of add any meat to the bones there, Michael?
I suppose just building on that, and again, we've acknowledged this, plenty of times here before, which is that, the way for us to be sustainable within the high needs block in Cambridgeshire, in addition to everything Sarah's just said, is to make sure that we reduce our reliance historically, currently on the high needs independent sector placements, where it's not just a case of the higher cost, but we may also at times question the value for money compared to our state funded special schools, and it's a capacity issue largely. So we need to keep pushing DfE to clarify when those two new special schools that are long awaited for us, 270 funded places, will be provided. In parallel, we need to use the new capital money we're getting to increase the amount of specialist provision that is hosted in mainstream, so extending the enhanced resource bases. But actually in doing that, and the school leaders that are helping with this, thinking beyond enhanced resource bases where children leave their school and move on roll to the school that's hosting that, to enhance resource provision, which is much more about, for want of a much better phrase, that turnaround provision, where it's time limited. They remain on roll at their local school. They come back. The places are used in that way. That's how you make a reality of local meaningful inclusion placements. All of that together enables you to then reinvest in earlier support and get a virtuous cycle out of a vicious circle that we're in at the moment. So it's all of those aspects that we have to do. And also, we all acknowledge, don't we, that DfE have set out something here over a 3-year period. And we need to make sure that we can demonstrate success in that first year, first 18 months of this, and keep asking for clarity about what will happen at the end of that period, whether that's to do with the high needs block or whether it's to do with that burdens extra funding that we're having, so that we can fulfill those extra support mechanisms that will make it free at the point of delivery for schools, which is what they so often need to be able to meet needs much earlier, so that children, increasingly, schools and parents wouldn't be thinking about this thing we call an education, health and care plan, because the school would have the advice, they'd have the guidance, they'd have funding, and they'd be able to meet needs effectively. And then we'd put more and more of our support into on the ground rather than that sort of administration, and those EHCPs, quite rightly, then being done on time, annual reviews effective for those children with the most complex needs. We've got to do all of this at the same time, but that capital sufficiency side of it, using that extra funding from the DfE, is also going to be critical here, so that we can reduce the higher costs where it isn't necessarily value for money, it's just higher cost, and that's not enabling us to invest earlier in the system.
Thank you very much for that answer. So next question is on the experts at hand, which is a fundamental thread within the white paper and within this plan. My concern is that we're already having issues in recruiting some of these specialist staff and specialist provision within the council, and this isn't just a Cambridgeshire issue, this is a national issue. What reassurance can you give us that we are going to be able to recruit into these places, and that also these staff aren't going to be seen as a preferential job compared to our current staff? Because I can see that our current employees have huge caseloads. They have a big backlog to try and clear, as well as the new caseload that's coming in, where the experts at hands will be starting from a fresh slate, essentially being able to do a different role, but with the same job title. So what reassurance can you give us that, one, we can employ we're going to be able to employ members to become these experts at hand, but secondly, that we're going to be able to continue to retain the staff that we currently have? We're not seeing a them and us kind of scenario within the team.
So in terms of the which way to go first in this? Okay, so in terms of the ability to recruit staff. So I mean, first thing is to say that we would be very clear in the plan to put out, and this is for the DfE audience, not necessarily yourselves, but we've been set out in the clear. This is indicative, illustrative of the kind of staffing that we would look at through experts at hand, because we do need to make sure that that we set out in the plan the kind of ways that we would use that, but we reserve the right locally, don't we, to sort of test things out in the autumn and spring term before we fully commit to doing things. And the reason I mention that is that, for example, we know with educational psychology that there is that need to grow your own, and therefore invest in trainees and assistant EPs as well, and how they can help with that model also of early support. Similarly, health colleagues have set out how a similar approach can be taken with assistant speech and language therapists and OTs. The national headline around EPs, speech and language therapists, OTs, needs to be nuanced, because we need to make sure that if there are assistants that can be recruited quicker, can be deployed more effectively, then that's one good way that we can do to either mitigate the risk of national shortages in certain sectors, but also the grow your own approach means that for lots of different reasons, maybe good old-fashioned loyalty, people stick around and having been invested, invest back into the system. So we need to do all of that. That's one way that we can try to mitigate the risks about being able to recruit, but I'm not going to suggest that that's going to be straightforward in all of those sectors. In terms of that risk around how you recruit into new roles when you've got these issues, I suppose two things. One is just to reflect, just to acknowledge that that is a real issue. I've certainly been involved in models in the past where that's been an issue with actually staff coming out of schools into local authority positions, where you've been trying to put a model together to wrap around schools, and the irony is that people come out of the school system and that can cause some flux for a while. So that's why the partnership of doing this with school leaders is going to be so important, to make sure that we plan that. But I think the most important thing is, back to a point Sarah's made a number of times around the education redesign. We were designing our education services, those that focus on whole school improvement, along with those that focus on cohorts of children, individual children, in parallel with the thinking that was coming out from the DfE even before they formally published the plans, to try to make sure that our plan wouldn't be seen as a kind of, this is the current offer we do from a staffing point of view, and this is the new that will only be relevant for new staff. It's a redesign. So from the new academic year onwards, all of the staffing, no matter where they're funded from, and that includes the high needs block. So we'll have a mixture of funding streams, the core budget we have, the new funding, and the high needs block. It's all one term, one team, one service, and we'll need to implement that in a way where people are seeing the benefits of their reduced caseloads and benefits of working much earlier in the system, which people want to do, in addition to some posts, which, yes, let's be honest, it can be very attractive because it's a new, exciting role and people will be interested in that. There will be plenty of people, I'm sure, and plenty of posts that if we need to backfill when change happens, that's part and parcel what we do. And the important thing is we determine when a new post starts, so we can sequence that to make sure that risk that you've highlighted, which is real, can be mitigated. We certainly don't want to create gaps where we've got current good provision and then cause problems we haven't yet got at the moment. Yeah, but I acknowledge it is a risk with this kind of big rollout.
Thank you very much. Councillor Goldsack, then Councillor Beckett.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Sarah. Let me first say, I think you guys are in a very, very difficult position. I think what the government has put on you and what you're facing with day-to-day pressures, it's almost untenable. So I take my hat off to you for what we are getting output. However, I do have issues and I want to raise them now. The Inclusion for All programme started early 25, is that correct?
It was November 24. That it was
24, November 24. Right. So I really like the set of measurables that you've put in the report that will become the KPIs to measuring on. But if I could see those against the last 12-month reports on EHCPs, that would be really useful, because I'm just thinking what we're seeing here and what we constantly said, we have this conversation most meetings, is a whole lot of disparate information that's not being joined up. Right. So if I look at the performance, and it's actually in the report under a later section today, but if I look at the red rated EHCP support, which is exactly following on from Councillor Goodliffe's questions, we lowered the bar to 20% a year ago. And to the end of March, we've attained 20% once. That's the only measurement I've got in front of me of the whole of those KPIs. That's just not good enough, and that's letting down too many people, too many children, too many families in our area. And when I then do some research, which I did before I came today, and I look at the comparative chart of EHCP timeliness for local authorities to us, Bedford, Central Bedfordshire, Hertfordshire, Peterborough, Lincoln, Norfolk, Suffolk, Essex, we are by far the lowest on the annual basis. We've got the lowest performance across all of those. And in fact, if I tell you that Lincolnshire is at 95% of their 20-week performance, Peterborough is at 89%, and Bedford is at 74%. It really worries me that we published the figures last year at 8%. And with respect, we've got these programs running in the background. We're waiting on the white paper coming. we should be doing something more now. Now, I've heard what you've said in answer to some really good questions and really good challenges for you. And as I say, I respect that you've got to sit there and answer the challenges, and you've answered them as well as you can. But I do think, in relate to some of the emails I've seen from residents and residents advocates that have come through this week, we are letting people down. And I think we've got to face up to it and say it. And quite frankly, I'm getting a little bit frustrated at this committee that we keep having these same conversations. Martin will vouch. I've asked to speak to Martin about education. And, we've got a meeting booked next week to have an honest conversation about where I think we're at and where I think we need to be going. But I just want to know what we can be doing more than waiting for jam tomorrow. Because at the moment, we're not going to get to jam tomorrow because we're letting down far, far too many people. And by the way, in support of this, I've also got meetings within the next week with heads of local schools in my wards, just to verify the feedback that what they're seeing from their end back. So I shall have those completed by the time I sit down with you, Martin. But, I don't want this to be a beating up session. I want this to be a what more can be done to support session. I mean, I look at the report that said, so when we put 700,000 plus into EHCP work last autumn, it shot up to 23%. Then it shot down again in January to 4%. And I'm like, why? Where's the rationale? Where have we seen that? And just one last point before I sit down and be quiet. We were constantly told there's an upward trend and things are improving. And yet in the report today, which is a later item, I admit, but if you jump forward to it and have a look, the reports are the January, February and March figures are all well below the 20% deadline. And today is the first time I've seen those. I haven't heard mention that we haven't attained the 20% we haven't seen it. It hasn't been mentioned in this committee in the last couple of months. Now, they may have only just come out. I appreciate that. But you see where I'm coming from here. You guys are working so hard and doing everything that you possibly is in front of you. But sometimes I think we've got to stop, pause, let the wheel keep spinning and saying, what are we doing wrong here? Because our comparative chart of analysis with local authorities isn't good. Our level of performance that we are reporting isn't good. Our level of pain being felt by our recipients of EHCPs or non-recipients of EHCPs isn't good. Something's got to change. Sorry, please help me find what that change is going to be. And can we see, let me ask the question, can we see backdated KPIs that you've listed against our current level of performance to give us some idea of where the problems are? Because I'm not seeing them.
Thank you. So I'm not going to disagree with the data that you've made reference to and the challenge that we have in front of us. But just to give some context to the data that you've made reference to, and Michael has got some updated data that we can share with you in terms of where we have improved. The data regarding the 20 weeks, to get that to the scale of, the other local authorities that you've made reference to, we could do that more quickly if we only prioritise the new requests. So once an assessment is delayed over that 20-week timeline, obviously it's not going to be reflected in that data. So we don't want to do that, and we've been challenged by committee about that, because if we did, and I'll come to your other points, but if we did, that would then be inequitable in terms of those children and young people that have been waiting for that assessment. So the only way to improve that data is to have that balance between the prioritisation of risk in the delays and the new requests. And on that point, in terms of, well, where is the data to support improvement? I mentioned earlier that we typically get around 150 requests for a plan on a monthly basis, and the capacity to then manage that demand, we have tripled that from being able to get through 35 June 2025 to 70 by the end of the year, and to currently 100 requests. So we have improved significantly the performance, but as you highlight, it is compromised by capacity. So we've still got that gap of 100. We're getting through 100 rather than 35, but the demand is around 150. And more recently, it's a couple of months we had 236, 230. So that gap is significant. So we're not sat on that gap. We triggered the education redesign. And as I said, through that redesign, we are adding additional capacity through the 11 full-time equivalent assistant caseworkers and the 2 full-time assistant caseworkers and additional educational psychologist support. The other issue that compromises the ability to improve at the pace that members would like to see is, obviously, we talked about the competing priorities. So we also have deadlines around the annual reviews and the transitions. And so there are prescribed deadlines to meet there that then means you're redirecting the workforce from managing the numbers of requests to then manage the annual reviews. So the way we're addressing that is through the education redesign and also through the application of new funding through the Experts at Hand funding and others, and through the stability grant, which is dependent obviously on our plan approval, which, as challenged, we do feel that the feedback so far is that it's a robust plan. So we're very mindful of the time frame it's taking to illustrate in data that you can see the level of improvement. But I suppose if you're asking directly, what can we do for you? I guess it is accepting that when you are in a position that we were in when we were inspected in January 2024, the ability to get back into a position where we're doing, we're performing in line with this, the data that you shared, does take some time. And we can illustrate that we are moving towards it. And and some of that data is obviously compromised by us adopting that equitable approach. So I think the SEND reform plan is a realistic SEND reform plan that recognises the context that we are operating within. And you will see within it that we're saying we expect that the numbers of educational health and care plans will actually increase, because as we apply that approach that we talked through to support schools who are waiting for delayed plans, as those plans start coming through, you will see an increase, not a decrease, which is the aspiration of that plan by meeting needs earlier. So I think what we're asking committee to do is to support the approach articulated within the plan, accept the significance of the changes that we're trying to make, and recognise that the data that illustrates that improvement is not necessarily going to deliver at the pace that you would like, because we have to adopt an equitable process. But we have got some data that we can articulate that improvement through. Thank you.
Yeah, so I suppose I just want to say, first of all, acknowledging that, we don't want to be at 9% we were last year. We don't want to be on those. There'll be a difference of opinion about the 20% target and the 46% national average. There are different opinions about that. I understand that and I respect that. But what I do need to say to make sure that we're doing the right thing by the teams and by committee and everyone else is to be clear about what we've set out, why we've done it, and how we've reported that. So in the April committee report here, not in the performance report, in the Inclusion for All report, where we said we would always provide a particular update on the HCP figures in addition to the spotlight item, we did set out in that where we were heading towards that 20% target that we'd set. And I said in the October committee when we talked about that the reason for recommending that we didn't have that historic target of 70% is because, in my experience, having done this for a long time in different places, the motivation of staff, amongst other things, when you've got a historic target of 70% and you're at 9%, doesn't help when you're trying to do stretch targets. You set out 20%, you set out national average for the year after of 46%. Doesn't mean you're going to be satisfied with 20. You try and break that, but you're not going to get to 70. And we need to be honest and realistic with everyone about that. And then we can talk about, you know, how that's done. We did finish 2025, the last 3 months, at 22% average performance. And in the first 3 months of this year, we were looking at 18% across those first 3 months, and that's been dipping down in individual months since then, because ironically, for want of a better phrase, because of the phase transfer issue. The staff have been switched from initial assessments to work on certain annual review phase transfer cases. So, you know, the same team who are trying to do initial assessments, annual reviews, and phase transfer will at different times in the year be deployed to different parts of the system. The new education design we've done is making sure that that doesn't happen to the same degree. There's more stability about people who are just working on initial assessments, on annual reviews, on the phase transfer. That's how we're looking at doing that. So I did just want to say that in the April report last time, very clearly we set that out. And I just need to say this because obviously I live and breathe this, and I realise it can be confusing in terms of how the figures work. When we talk about the 9% that's in the public domain on the record, that's the cumulative average for that year. It was for the calendar year 2024, and it was also for the calendar year 2025. We map this each month. So when I say I'm confident that we will get to that 20% figure by the end of this calendar year, it's because I know there will be peaks and troughs in the year, and we're tracking towards that. That's different to if people think 20% is good enough or not. But I'm just commenting on the fact that people can understandably be concerned, how are we going to achieve the target we set if we've got some low months? It's because last year we had 3 months, because I remember Councillor Goodliffe asking me if it was an error in the data last October committee. There were 3 months in a row of 0%. That wasn't an error, that was real, because we'd been working on backlog cases and none of the new ones had been green. And then later in the autumn term, we did many more new ones, and it's the mix between those that creates that figure and the way that the DfE asks us to report on it. So the undeniable fact is that, as Sarah said, a tripling of the actual output this first 5 months of this year compared to the 5 months last year. But the percentage of those in time is still just nudging us up towards the 20% that will be for December and December 2027 for 46%. For us to be able to do 95% and 75% and whatever the other local authorities are doing in the region can't happen overnight. I know how long it took Norfolk to get there because I was there doing it with them, and that didn't happen quicker than 3 years. And so there are ways to do this quicker, but to do it in an honest, transparent, sustainable way is the way we've set out. And I'm very happy to keep learning and keep having fresh pair of eyes on doing this better, differently, quicker. But I did just need to set out that we have set the figures out previously to illustrate very transparency what we mean when we talk about the 20%. And we all want to get there much quicker than we currently are.
All right.
Thank you. And thank you for your honesty as well. I do appreciate it. I really do. If I could just have one point for clarification, and that is in the report on, I can't remember what page, 244 of the report. I know it's a later section, but it's in exactly what we're talking about now. It says that January was 4.8, February was 8.7, March was 11.7. Are you then annualizing March to March, February to February, January to January to get to you're almost at 20%? Or is that, am I reading that wrong? I just want to understand whether my clarification of that is correct.
When I talk about the 20% that we have set for the target to achieve in December. When we're sitting here in December, if we've got to 20%, it will be because there is a cumulative 20% across the whole of that 12-month period. I will cross-reference this later in terms of the performance report and what we've got in the narrative here and what I was referencing back in the April report, because, and I don't want to confuse things too much, but there are two factors that the DFE require us to report on for EHCP. And that's to do with the phrases exceptions, allowable exceptions. So what that means in simple terms is that there are two data sets that the DFE have on EHCP from everyone in the country. And it's those plans that are late, but allowed to be late, as it were, because either a parent has missed an appointment that was critical to the assessment, or critically, where we are in this time of year, if referrals are made before a long summer break and we can't stick to the timescales. So I will double check to make sure that we're not that those figures are accurate across the two data sets, but the 20% will be cumulative across the calendar year.
Thank you very much. We've had quite a long sort of discussion about this, but it is really, really important. I've just got two more questions and then I think we will wrap it up. So Councillor Beckett and then Councillor Damry-Homan.
Just to comment on your previous answer, actually, I do fully support the way that you're trying to do it in terms of making it as equitable as possible, making sure that we're not just sort of smashing through KPIs and only assessing new assessments. I think that's the right approach. And thank you for explaining that. Going back to risks and the capacity issues that Councillor Martin was referring to as well, I'd love to hear what the council is attempting to do to not only safeguard the recruitment of new roles, but to retain as well, such as onboarding effective and sort of slow building induction programs and training plans to support staff stick around.
So we already have a current system, and it's different for different parts of the service. There's a risk sometimes here, isn't it, when we talk about all these issues in the inclusion service, that we focus on an EHCP all the time for understandable reasons. So just to quickly talk about that particular part of the workforce, caseworkers, the new casework assistant role that we're bringing in, and business support are critical to that as well. And obviously educational psychology, who provide those particular reports for that part of the assessment. So there is currently a program, as I'm sure you would hope and expect, around induction, and the most important thing around the induction training is that the whole staff, whole day termly training that occurs is that constant refresh and reminder about aspects. So it might be that there's particular practice improvements. So educational psychologists might come to talk to the casework team about practice aspects, conversations, discussions where health professionals are part of those meetings as well, in addition to the technical knowledge about the 20-week assessment process and how that work is carried out. And in my experience, staff who've been here a long time benefit from induction training that new staff are getting, because things change and move. So that's a big feature of what we do. But of course, we've got our district teams as well, specialist teachers, specialist practitioners, family advisors, whole range of staff who work very closely day to day in schools. And again, there is the need for their training to be about practice that's up to date, as well as the sort of legislative side of things. So that occurs across the piece. The new staff that we're looking to come in are adding capacity to where we've currently got. So they'll be part of those teams. Like I said earlier, these won't be standalone teams. They will be part of the team to make sure that works. We're also reducing our reliance, coming down from a situation where we've had a lot of agency and fixed term staff, for understandable reasons, because of where we've been and everything Sarah's been talking about, where we were, what we've been doing to improve that. And a feature of a system that needs to improve sometimes is that you've got that agency and fixed term staff. And so through the education redesign, replacing those staff with permanent positions. Now, if some of those agency staff want to join us permanently, great, that'd be wonderful for continuity, but we understand that some people work in that way for those reasons. So we need to do all of that. And we do need to focus on that retention, because one of the big themes that we hear from schools and parents is the instability about the change in staff, and those relationships that are so important that then are break down and change. So we often talk about capacity here and people not being able to speak to caseworkers or other staff. We've had those themes discussed here, but as equally important is the fact that that when those staff change. So for me, it's making sure that we always reflect and review our training and induction, onboarding, as you said, to make sure that that is done in a good way. And if I think about educational psychology, for example, it's making sure that they know, how do we consider assessments in Cambridgeshire? Might think that educational psychology is just educational psychology, but there's a way that we work in this county, and the onboarding for them is to make sure that they know how we consider reflecting children's needs in our professional reports, and making sure that they're comfortable and knowledgeable about how we do that. And that's regardless of whether we're using locums or our own new permanent staff. So all of the above, really.
Can I just add one thing? Because I think the most significant thing that makes a difference to the workforce is knowing that they're appreciated and that the work they do is recognised. And I think that in our new leadership team within education, with Michael as AD for inclusion, Alison as AD for education, I think that that's something that is at the heart of everything that we do. That we want our teams, despite the challenges and the significance of those challenges, to feel that they are doing a good job and recognising that they're doing a good job.
Thank you. Councillor Dumry-Homan.
Thank you, Chair. I'm also building on what Councillors Martin and Beckett have said, but I'm wondering if you can give us some sort of insight into the national government's view on matters. Appreciate if you can't. I'm just reflecting on the grant funding guidance, or the conditions of the grant, and it lays out an expectation that experts at hand funding should primarily support fully qualified professionals. I appreciate that we're looking to grow a lot of in-house talent. I think as us an authority, some reassurance that our growing of in-house talent isn't in contradiction with the grant conditions would be great. But more broadly, it's been raised today, it's in your papers, the risk with the amount of staff that is needed to meet the government's ambitions nationally feels huge. It feels like we need a lot of experts that we don't. We discussed last committee the challenges in ed psychs. We need a lot of staff around the country, and it feels like, as part of the national policy, that there is a huge risk with staffing. Have we, as a local authority, had any indication of the government's view on that risk, what they're doing to mitigate it, beyond saying they're throwing a couple of billion at it? I'd be very grateful for any insight into that, because it's what troubles me deeply. I think there's a lot of positives in the SEND reforms, but I'm just not entirely sure that they're actually going to be feasible from a staffing point of view. Thank you.
So the grant conditions you referenced, just to say that 31st of August is another deadline that we have, where we need to set out certain other aspects to the DfE around those plans for recruitment that we have, and obviously we'll be able to share that with yourselves. Part of that is scheduling and sequencing, that point about recruitment and where we will be able to do that swiftly and where there could be challenges, and we'll need to phase that in, and also it relates to the conditions around qualifications. So the guidance is relatively broad at the moment, and we think that we're everything that we're doing is in line with that. However, and I think Sarah referenced this earlier, that when we were developing the draft plan, all local areas were assigned 2 specialist advisors. So they're not DfE officials, but they're commissioned through the DfE, one around finance and data, you won't be surprised, and one around practice. And therefore, we'll have an ongoing relationship with those advisors. They've obviously seen the draft plan, fed back and suggested amendments prior to the final plan going in. They did not advise that anything on that section of the report was not meeting requirements, so they're confident that we're in line at the moment. I think there's going to be work over the summer break. We can't help but in education think of that period of time when there's a different sort of flow to our work, and I'm sure we'll be engaging with those advisors in an iterative way prior to that 31st of August deadline to make sure the aspect is set out. Now, I'm probably going to go into sort of personal view now, so this isn't scientific. I would be surprised if with all of those, what is it, 120, 140 local area response forms going into the DfE that are being looked at, that there's going to be some really good blueprints in there about things that have worked in local areas and been effective on the ground that might not look like they're quite in that orbit of formal qualifications in the way that the DfE might be looking at them. So if we're going to do the spirit of the 2014 reforms allied to these, which is all about co-production, which is all about working together, that is a golden thread from 2014 through to these reforms, then we need to acknowledge that effective practice looks different in different ways. And we need to be bold to say to the DfE, we think we've got a team around the school and team around the family model that is in line with your guidance, but some parts of it might look a bit different to what you were expecting. And I'm sure that will be happening in many, many local areas, and we'll all be learning from each other. And so that heavy dose of pragmatism based on what works in the real world, I think, is how we're going to be able to mitigate the risks that you've highlighted. I don't say that glibly because we've got a lot to do, but broadly, it's a positive aspect that we've got here. It's a real opportunity for us to do things nationally and locally that we haven't had. The reforms are long awaited, and it's great that money is flowing in advance of legislative change. That doesn't always happen. So yeah, I'll end on a positive if I can and say that we'll be doing our best to make sure that all of the above takes place, but we'll be realistic and we'll be reporting back here as regularly as we're required to the DfE on how it's all working.
Thank you very much indeed. And may I say on behalf of the whole committee, to congratulate you on producing such a clear and well thought through proposal and plan. Obviously, it's not without risk, but it is very well thought through, and we look forward to receiving reports about how it is all going in this massive change that we're embarking on. What I'd like to do now, if it's acceptable to members, is we're asked to vote on this. First, to note the progress in co-producing a SEND reform plan in line with the guidance set out by the DfE and submitted, and also agree that the current forward plan's schedule of quarterly reports on the Inclusion for All programme will continue, and that these reports will incorporate the SEND reform plan and enable the DfE requirement for quarterly reporting to them to mirror the reporting locally to the committee. So if I may have a show of hands in support of that, please. I believe that is unanimous. Thank you very much. And thank you, Sarah and Michael. Appreciate it. It's been quite a long session, but really important. Thank you. And next we have two items that Chris Bush is going to introduce, and hopefully we can deal with these items before we have our 2-hour break. And I believe the first item is the interpretation translation contract, where Chris Bush, Service Director for Strategy and Commissioning, and Lizzie Robertson, the Commissioning Manager, are going to introduce the report.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, everybody. Very nice to see you all again. So yes, the first paper that I'm here to introduce to you all can be found on page 111 of your pack. And it seeks committee approval for the recommissioning of the Council's translation and interpretation services via what is described within the paper as a national framework multi-supplier model, which is a bit of a mouthful, but is also, I think, quite clearly explained in the paper in a much more helpful way than I've just described it. The proposal is for a 4-year arrangement to be put in place on a 3+1 basis, with 3 years being the initial term of the contract, drawing from an existing national framework with a total contract value of a maximum of £912,000 over the life of that contract, with the proposal that that service would begin from July 2027. This takes account of the fact that the current translation and interpretation service delivered by an organisation currently called The Big Word, that began in July 23, expires in July 2027. So we're seeking for a continuation of the contractual arrangements that we have. The paper sets out, I think, quite clearly, although we're happy to take questions, the comprehensive review that underpinned the options appraisal that you found in front of, that you find contained within the paper. It highlights some challenges which are set out in section 3 of the report, but the report also highlights some quite clear opportunities for meeting those challenges. As I've mentioned, the details options appraisal is set out in the paper at Appendix B. And as can be seen from this, that we recommend option B by coincidence, which is in line with the recommendation that we are making to committee today. This is based on the improvements that we think this option can deliver to address the challenges described, and the improvements themselves that we think are realised through the approach that we are recommending as set out in section 4.2 of the report. That, in very brief summary, is the paper, but we are of course happy to take any and all questions from the committee.
Thank you very much indeed. Are there any questions? Councillor Demery-Homan.
Thanks, Chris. I mean, broadly, it's a very reasonable request, very sensible paper. I was just wondering, do we have any programmes where we have residents engaging with the translation services? Do we have anything to refer them over to ESOL and other support outside of the context of this? I'm just always keen to link up our services where we can. Also, the more people we can get speaking English, hopefully less pressure on our translation services. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to say no, that we don't do that. I don't believe we do, but that might be a question that we have to double check on with Children's Services and the wider council. I know that most of the jobs that we do are from the Children's Directorate. A lot of them are social care related, and I would hazard a guess that maybe they're quite time related as well. So maybe if they're for a legal case or a particular child protection case, but whether that's a longer term decision, I would say that that could be done outside of the contract, but I can see Martin is poised.
Yeah, just to say, where we're looking after unaccompanied asylum-seeking children, or any child that comes into our care where English isn't their is a second or other language, then yeah, we do ensure that they enrol onto a course which will help them to improve their English.
Thank you. Any other questions? No, well, thank you very much. I think the report's very clear. May we move to the vote? We are asked to approve the recommissioning and procurement of the translation interpretation services with a service start in July 2027 and a maximum contract value of up to £912,000, and also delegate authority for awarding and executing a contract for the provision of these services starting July 2027 with the term of 3+1 years, and delegate the approval of any extension periods to the Executive Director for Children, Education and Families in consultation with the Chair and Vice Chair. Would those in favour of this please raise your hand? I do believe that's unanimous. Thank you very much indeed, members, and thank you for that report, and you're very welcome, Lizzie. Well done. And the next item on the agenda is the another item from Chris, which is the Children's SEND Education External Placement Commissioning, and Chris will introduce it, and Rosa De Maio, Senior Commissioning Manager, will answer questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chair. I promise this is my last one for today, everybody. So this second paper, again, found on page 129 of your pack, is seeking committee approval to the recommissioning of our external SEND education provision, which is the ISEPs, our out-of-school tuition, and our post-16 alternative education provision, to ensure the council can continue to meet its statutory responsibilities and sufficiency duties in this area. The paper proposes a new compliant 8-year commissioning framework to replace the current arrangements when they expire, and provides a sustainable and compliant route to market. The proposed terms of the contract of that 8 years is an initial 3-year term with options to extend that contract by 2 years, and then subsequently 1 year at the end, should that be necessary in future. Current framework expires in March 2028, and the estimated value of the new contract is approximately £651 million over the life of it, over its lifetime, though I would remind committee members that this is a framework contract, and any decision taken today does not commit the council to any specific level of expenditure. We pay for what we buy as we go along, but for the purposes of this paper, we've set out our very best estimates as to what the levels of expenditure we believe will be over the course of that lifetime. There's some important context to note, I believe, and I think we've just had an expansive debate here at committee about the pressures facing the SEND system as a whole, and I therefore will not repeat them all back to you after 90 minutes of really good debate about them. But we know that there's significant increases in usage of these types of provision across the piece, and that does bring us some very real sufficiency challenges, meaning that we have seen increased reliance on independent and out-of-county placements in particular, and that's one of the challenges that we are seeking to address in part through this through this proposal. We also know that there's some significant financial pressures that come with that, and the current commissioning arrangements are somewhat fragmented, duplicative and inefficient, and we have seen a significant proportion of provision that we're having to secure being done so outside of the current contractual arrangements because of the way that they're configured and because of the things that I've just said, at a considerably greater cost. Again, something that these proposals quite clearly speak to the addressing of throughout. The recommended option, therefore, is to establish a new Cambridgeshire framework for these 3 types of provision, with a framework that will begin in September 2027. You will note that a moment ago I mentioned that the current arrangements end in March 2028, but given the significant challenges and pressures and limitations of those current arrangements, we are keen to put in new and what we believe to be better arrangements as soon as we can, hence looking to put these in place before the end of the life of the current contract. I think it should also be just highlighted to committee, whilst I won't highlight everything in the interest of time, that aside from the improvements that are set out throughout the document in terms of reduction in fragmentation and increase in efficiency of the way we manage our local markets and a strengthening of our ability to quality assure the provision that we are using, there is also a modelled expectation of somewhere between 20 to 26% of cost avoidance in going down this route versus persisting with the exact current arrangements that we have in place as well, which, given the scale of what we're talking about, is not insignificant. And this is set out in some detail in 7.1 of the report for those that are particularly interested, although I'm sure you've all read it keenly. Those are the key highlights from me. Again, hopefully briefly enough, but please feel free to ask any questions.
Thank you very much. Who would like to ask any questions? Oh, sorry, Mark, Councillor Goldsack.
It's probably an obvious one, and I'm sure it's in there, but with the +2, +2, +1, I'm assuming there are built-in increases for inflation and things like that as we go through them.
Yes, so we're looking at inflation being incorporated into uplifts, and building that into the contracts going forward. Part of that model that we've put into the paper accounts for CPI index inflation against costs potentially going up each year.
Just a quick one on that. Can I congratulate you on 2 excellently presented papers? Well done.
Thank you. Are there any other, I mean, often the papers do speak for themselves. Yeah. Councillor Martin.
Thank you very much, Chair. Just wanted to ask around prioritising local markets, because obviously working in a framework such as this is likely to squeeze out some of the smaller providers that are currently providing for us, because the barriers of being able to work through this sort of framework is substantial. We've seen that through early years provision within this council already. What steps are you taking to ensure that we're not going to be pricing out, we're not going to adding a significant burden to those smaller providers to ensure that the kids that are using this service are going to get the best service for them, not the biggest service? Because I'm concerned that we are already shipping a lot of young people out of catchment and out of area. I just want to ensure that this framework isn't going to mean more kids are being shipped further afield when there is provision on the doorstep. It's just harder for them to access a framework such as this.
I can answer that. So we are actually conducting some market engagement currently. We started in April this year, and we're doing monthly focus groups with our provider market. We're inviting them along on a monthly basis, and we've got themes. We actually had one today, which is around training opportunities. We're going to be working with procurement to familiarise and socialise providers to the new platforms that we'll be using. We've got other ones about like what good policies look like, so that providers feel equipped with going forward, so they don't feel excluded because they are smaller. So we want to ensure that we're investing in providers that are close to the children's homes, and we appreciate that that could be on the borders, as we do recognise that it can take an hour and a half to get from the north of the county to the south. So we're trying to engage with as many new and existing providers to ensure that everybody has a fair, equitable access to join the DPS. So we're trying to prepare them as best we can ahead of that. So we'll be leading those focus groups between now and January, with an indicative timeline to start the procurement process from January, February next year.
Thank you. Any other questions? Councillor Beckett.
I remember asking you this when we had our members workshop ahead of this committee session, but just to reiterate it, can I just double check that will be existing providers will also be invited in to understand the DPS and how that's working?
Yes, so it includes existing and new. So we have advertised the market engagement focus groups, which is out in the public domain, and we are also still continuing with our provider engagement events as well. We've got one scheduled for July. We'll have another one later on in the year. We normally do them termly. So engaging with our providers is really important to us, so that they're fully informed and they feel part of the process as well.
Thank you very much. Right, may we move to the vote? We're asked to agree to the recommissioning of this of the external SEND education provision to implement an 8-year contract and to with an estimated total expenditure of up to 651.6 million over an 8-year period, and also to delegate the authority for awarding and executing the framework agreements to the Executive Director for Children, Education and Families in consultation with the Chair and Vice Chair. Would all those in favour of these proposals raise your hand? Right. Thank you. That's unanimous. Thank you very much. I believe we might just have time to deal with the next item, porting funding for the reprovision of Abbey College sixth form, before we take our break. So Alison Kramer is going to present this. It's a very clear paper. Thank you very much. And this is an issue that we've come across in this committee before. So I wonder if you could just quickly summarise your proposal, Alison.
Thank you. The Children and Young People Committee is asked to approve delegating authority for the grant funding agreement to the Executive Director for Children, Education and Families, the Executive Director of Resources and Finance, in consultation with the Chair and Vice Chair of this committee, for the project set out in section 3.6 of the report. The project is to re-provide 200-place sixth form accommodation at Abbey College, which is an academy school in Meridian Trust, through the porting of funding to Meridian Trust. A scheme has been designed to repurpose the Ramsey Locality Office on the site, which is a council building that is no longer in use, as the sixth form centre for the school. And the project will be funded through a combination of Cambridgeshire County Council funding and community infrastructure levy from Huntingdonshire District Council. And as we've referenced in it, this has come to this committee before, and at March's Children and Young People's Committee, it was acknowledged that Abbey College has complex site and building issues, where there is currently a lease in place for the north section of the site, which expires in June 27. And many of the buildings on the north part of the site are condition expired, and the repair is unaffordable. So Meridian Trust have a strategic vision to redevelop the south of the site, and there was agreement at this committee in March to port funding to Meridian Trust to carry out an expansion project at the school due to rising catchment demand for pupils aged 11 to 16, which is another element of this overall scheme. Porting funding to the Trust recognises that Trust-led delivery is best placed to manage the site-specific complexities, to integrate works efficiently and minimise disruption while ensuring timely delivery of high-quality education provision. And the developments at Abbey College require a coordinated whole-site approach aligned to Meridian Trust's wider strategic vision for the school and the site. And then finally, just to say that the checks for competence to run expansion projects on the council's behalf, as we've set out in the appendix, have been completed, and Meridian Trust was successful in meeting the standards required.
Thank you very much indeed. Are there any questions? Councillor Goldsack.
Thank you. Once again, a very good report. In 3.1, I just want to be clear that on the maths here, an area I often fall down on. So we allocated 3.048 million in our budget back in March, of which you've attained 1.86 from Cambridgeshire County Council, 1.31 million from Huntingdon, and 300,000 from the trust itself, making 3.4 million. So we're already running a 4.7, 4.5, 450k. Not profit, it's the wrong word, additional funding. Care to explain that? I just don't understand that, or
Yes.
I've got the maths wrong.
No, you haven't got the maths wrong. Apologies for that. The reference to the Meridian Trust funding is that's funding they've committed across the whole of the Abbey College redevelopment projects, and the funding from Huntingdonshire District Council and Cambridgeshire County Council is the value of this particular project to repurpose the sixth form. But we were illustrating here that Meridian Trust are also putting funding in across the whole of the programme. So it's not specifically for the sixth form, it's across the whole site, that additional amount. So the sixth form is the first two amounts together. Apologies if that wasn't clear.
I can. So just to be clear about that, right?
Yes.
Meridian have put in £300,000 on a plethora of projects for their site, maybe the whole site, the whole school, plus their sixth form. But the funding for the sixth form work, which I think is excellent, by the way, and shows good education and trust, the trust and the council working together. So well done. That covers the 3.48, if not to the penny, then fairly close.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I've got Councillor Goodliffe and Councillor Demery-Homan.
Thank you. Totally understand the need, as Councillor Goldsack has said, for good sixth form education. but it's the complexity, I think. A couple of things. The lease, who holds the liability when that lease reverts back next year? Who will have the ownership of the south site once the sixth form is located there? And do we have any definite requirement that that building stays as sixth form provision unless agreed with us as the county council, or can the trust, in 4 years' time decide to use it as something completely different?
I can answer part of those questions, but not all of them. In relation to the what happens when the lease reverts next year, I would have to come back to you on that. I don't have the exact information on that to hand, so we will come back with that. In relation to sorry, there were two other parts to your question, weren't there? So yeah, sorry. So would you mind repeating them? Sorry, thank you.
Who would have the ownership of the south site once that's redeveloped, and what is the requirement for the provision to stay as sixth form unless with agreement?
Yeah. So in relation to the requirement to remain as a sixth form, there are specific conditions that will be set out in the grant funding agreement, and that will stipulate very clearly the requirements for that, and that will be monitored and tracked. So I think that is protected against within the grant funding agreement. In relation to the ownership of the south part of the site, as you say, it is a complex site and there are different parts of the site. So I think probably it would be most helpful for us to come back specifically on the whole site, both the north and the south, and explain that, because different parts of the development are under different leaseholds.
Slightly tricky, Chair, to vote on something where we're not really sure who would then who would become the owner of the site that we're talking about. I don't know what you want to do about that.
Well, I think you must just decide how you would like to vote on this. We've had the explanation from the officer.
So we do have the details of the lease arrangements, and there are parts of the site owned by the county and parts owned by another trustee, and we have met with Meridian Trust and sought assurance on those arrangements. I just wanted to be really specific about them, so that's why I'd want to bring them back to you more specifically than a high level answer.
Thank you. Councillor Damery-Homan.
If I may, I might make a suggestion in response to Councillor Goodliffe's comments. Obviously, the decision is made with yourself and the Vice Chair, or in consultation with, so perhaps the least concerns can be resolved by that point before the contract is signed off. My question was, so it's great to see some SIL funding going into this. We put roughly 3 million into the business plan. This SIL funding, does that result in either a saving to us or a reduced amount of borrowing, or was the SIL funding always factored into this, please?
It does result in a reduced amount of borrowing. It was an application we made to SIL, and we were awaiting the outcome of that decision, which came through in March, which is why this part of the proposal has come at a separate stage to the earlier porting to Meridian Trust, because we were waiting on the outcome of that bid.
Thank you very much. Are there any other questions? So one way forward is that we vote on this to approve delegating authority to take this forward, but it's with the consultation of the Chair and Vice Chair, and obviously we will make sure that we understand the detail that you would like to feed back first and inform the committee before we make the decision. So if you're happy with that undertaking, if we could move to a vote, please, that this is to approve, subject to what I've just said, to approve delegating authority for executing the grant funding agreement to the Exec Director of Children, Education and Families in consultation with the Chair and Vice Chair of Children and Young People's Committee for this project. So all in favour? Thank you. Unanimous. Thank you very much indeed. So it's 4:11 by that clock, which is way off, isn't it? I make it 16:04. So if we could be back at 16:14, please.
We're not voting on 9.
Thank you very much. Let's reconvene. I hope you've had a refreshing break. So for various reasons, what we're going to do is we are going to take item 10 next. That is the Finance Monitoring Report to May 2026. I'd like to ask Martin Perbrick, please, to introduce this.
Hello. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. So the paper presents the forecasted overall position at the end of May 2026, and that highlights an £11.1 million pressure at the end of that month. Home to school transport is forecast to overspend by 4.5 million across SEND, mainstream and looked after children's transport. And the largest non-DSG pressure relates to children in care placements, with external placements forecast to overspend by £5.2 million. Fostering, adoption and corporate parenting is forecasting a 6.74k overspend. This is mainly due to high numbers of children placed with connected person carers and increased demand for supervised family time. Targeted support and children's in need services and children's social care services is forecasting 310 overspend, reflecting demand-led Section 17 children in need costs, including support for families with no recourse to public funds and court-ordered specialist assessments. There has been a reduction in reliance on agency staff, which has reduced some costs, and the pressures are partially offset by a forecast 500k overachievement against the vacancy factor. Well, bear in mind, these are forecasts at the beginning of a long year. The DSG, the Dedicated Schools Grant, position remains the major financial area of concern. The revised cumulative DFG forecast of £96.2 million was brought forward into the year, with an opening forecast pressure in year of £63 million. Martin Wade has got some. Do you want to add some comments about the environments, Martin, please?
Yeah, I will do. Thank you, Martin. So obviously in this report, one of the things that we're asking members to endorse are 2 budget environments of over £175,000, which can be seen in section 3.5 of the covering report. Both of these relate to moving money from, but one from early years service and one from virtual school to support the education redesign. And obviously you've spoken at length about the pressures in that area. Earlier linked to SEND reforms. So the first one is the early years service, where due to an increase in the DSG budget we've received for early years, this is allow us to release £231,000 of core budget to support that investment in SEND capacity. Likewise, within the virtual school, they've received an increase in looked after children pupil premium and pupil premium plus grant, which will allow £200,000 worth of core funding to be released to support those SEND pressures. In both of those instances, those environments won't have a detrimental impact on the service provision for either early years or virtual school.
Thank you very much. Any questions? Councillor Whelan.
That's on, yeah. Yeah, just one really about the impact of moving from the early years. Will that have an impact on the early intervention and school resilience or readiness on that, please?
Yeah, so no, because there's been an overall increase in the amount of early years dedicated schools grant received for this financial year, it won't have a detrimental impact on any of the provision from the early years service. So it's just allowing us to free up that core budget.
Thank you. Any other questions? Councillor Martin.
Thank you very much, Chair. Looking at table 3.2, showing the forecast outturn variance, it shows for the DSG side that we're looking at a £63.2 million overspend forecast by the end of the year, which is twice this year's outturn, and which represents a 50% overspend, which is obviously a massive concern. We spoke earlier about the grants that's going to be coming in to cover previous years, but as far as I understand, that's not going to cover future years in the same way. So I just want to see some clarification. Will the grants cover that amount? Because a £63 million overspend is huge, considering the deficit, I believe, at the moment is around £100 million. That would increase our deficit by a huge amount and could be a big issue for this council in the next 12 months.
Yeah, so just a little bit of clarity, or try and provide some clarity about the SEND Stability Grant. So yeah, you're exactly right. So what's initially been announced is that the SEND Stability Grant will cover 90% of the cumulative deficit up to the end of the last financial year. So as Martin's already alluded to, we carried forward £96 million DSG deficit, so we'd expect approximately 90% of that to be covered by the SEND Stability Grant. What the DfE have said and what the government have said in terms of moving forward, that there will be similar mechanisms in place for any deficits which were accrued in any of the next 2 financial years. So we're expecting some similar mechanism to be in place for both 26, 27 and 27, 28. However, at this stage, they've not said exactly what that means in terms of how much will be covered. So I think we're just waiting for further guidance in terms of the amounts of any further allocation of funding for future year deficits which accumulated.
Thank you very much for that clarification. Obviously, we'll wait to see what comes back from the department, but I am very concerned that if this amount of money ends up hitting our balance sheet, the MRP alone on £63 million worth of debt is just £7.5 million worth of revenue every single year for the term. So that's a huge amount to be coming out of our revenue budget, less than anything else. So I just wonder what conversations have been had with the Section 151 officer around this level of overspend, considering it is twice what it was the year that's just finished.
Yeah, you're right. So yeah, so we've obviously been speaking, keeping Michael Hudson informed about the position around this. So obviously the hope expectation is that obviously as soon as a SEND reform submission is signed off, we will obviously receive that 90% payment, which will be, we understand that's going to be paid to local authorities in the autumn term, which obviously then reduce down that cumulative deficit back down to considerably less than the 100 million effectively we're carrying on the balance sheet now. Obviously, we accept that then that will then push this number back up again, but it will still be below the current level of cumulative deficit we're holding. So we're just obviously monitoring that very carefully as part of the overall council position. And obviously, as I say, we're still waiting for clarification from the DfE on the kind of the timing and the process going forward. But rest assured, it is very much high on the kind of the conversations with the Section 151 officer.
Thank you. Councillor Tong.
Hello. Firstly, thank you for this report. I understand the importance of home to school transport. I think we all do in this room, as well as how much it costs to provide. However, the overspend of 4.5 million is a lot. And what I wanted to ask is about how we are going to factor in this high cost into the budget in future, because the report notes there's a sustained growth in demand for this service. Obviously, we did not predict quite how high that growth was. Could I ask how our expectations slipped from the real growth we are seeing in demand for this service?
Yeah, so this is a kind of an annual question we get in terms of the kind of the demand, and I think it's fair to say that it's a combination of factors. I think what's interesting is the last financial year we actually saw a reduction in overall pupil numbers across primary and secondary schools. So you'd kind of think we'd start to see a similar kind of reduction in the overall costs. However, most of the costs that we're seeing are driven by special educational needs and the additional costs related to the complexity of need of those children children as well in that space. So the combination of the factors we look at, as I say, is overall population. We obviously look at the kind of the catchment schools for secondary schools as well, to try and predict the kind of the overall numbers we're going to see going into those schools as well. I think also we've obviously, and again, you've spoken about it at length today, around the kind of the SEND provision and where those young people are now having to go because of the shortage of places in our mainstream schools as well. So we do try and factor all of that in. I think you're right to point out that there has been a kind of a difference between what we've kind of predicted, and each on an annual basis. We work very closely with Sarah Allison and their services to try and refresh those forecasts looking forward. So it's something we're always looking to refine, but unfortunately it's not an exact science due to a number of factors in that space.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Are there any other questions or comments? In that case, thank you very much for that. And obviously we have, a lot of work to do scrutinising and monitoring the finances around education and particularly SEND. But in the meantime, we are asked to note the report, note and endorse the proposed budget environments detailed in section 3.5, and that is to put them forward to the Strategy, Resources and Performance Committee for approval. May I have a show of hands of those in favour of doing those things, please? Thank you. That is unanimous. Thank you very much. May we look now at item 9, the outturn for last year, the Finance Monitoring Report. Martin Purbrick, would you like to introduce this, please?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Happy to do so. So the outturn for the 25-26 financial year saw the overall non-DSG position finish with an overspend of 11.3 million. The largest pressure within that was children in care placements, as it is in the current year, and that was finished with an overspend of 8.4 million. As we know, this is mainly due to increased demand for residential care for a relatively small number of children with highly complex needs. There was also other pressures within the within the service level pressures. Education services ended the year with a 3.95 million pound overspend. The most significant element of that was again home to school transport, with the same reasons that Martin has already provided, increasing numbers for children across SEND needing specialist transport. The 0 to 25 year disability service ended the year with a 9.74 overspend, driven by increased eligibility of children requiring community support, short breaks and direct payments. And there are also areas where mitigation was found. So targeted support and children's social care ended with a net underspend of £273,000, supported by restructures, vacancy management, grant income, and reduced reliance on agency staff in key teams, which continues to be some mitigation this year. We've already spoke about the DSG in the previous report, so I won't repeat myself there. But the report shows a service under considerable financial pressure, but only in the areas that we are aware of, areas that are facing national pressures, which we are seeing play out locally.
Thank you. Are there questions for one or other of the Martins? It is an opportunity to scrutinise what has happened in the expenditure for the year past, because that is often quite a good indicator of what expenditure is going to be like in the coming year. So if there's any elements in this that you feel require explanation, now is the time to ask. Or has it been? Councillor Goldsworth.
I won't let you down. Just one little one. Is it possible to get some analysis between school transport costs send related and school transport cost place related? I often think we all just think about, oh, it's a cost of getting our children to school, but a lot of these decisions, and I've just come through with a lot of people in my area, we've just come through the appeal process and they've all got in. Otherwise, we were looking at costs, and I'm just thinking, like, such a fine line of margin really as to whether the schools will take them and whether they can fit them in, and a lot of that stuff we're not responsible for. So I'm just wanted to understand, what's the real cost to us of the decisions on whether a school place is available or not, or as the one that we've got to provide for send reasons?
So I believe I can help with that. So I think on page 175 of the bundle, there is a breakdown of the home to school transport overspend, and it breaks it down into the different areas. So there's the special schools, that is, and of 29 million, and there's the mainstream schools, which I guess is more the distance. Councillor Goodliffe.
It's on a different point. Is that all right?
Could we finish this one first? Unless there's something that Martin Wade would like to add.
So obviously what you've pointed out there, Chair, is obviously the split in terms of the budget. I think, Councillor, can I just check what you were saying, is it's not just where we're spending the money as it's shown in the report, but necessarily some of the avoided costs that could be by providing a place. Is that right?
Come at it from the other way and try and explain it a little bit more. As I say, we've just had, let's say, 3 pupils' appeals to get into the local secondary school. If not, they were offered places approximately 18 miles away to get to their nearest secondary school. That would have been at the cost of the council to get them into that thing. Now, they have all subsequently been accepted into the local secondary school, so it's not an issue. But potentially that's an impact on a budget of 3 times 36 mile a day round trips to and from school. Now, the chances are we put them in one vehicle or blah, blah, blah. But do you see what I'm saying? It seems like a bit of a lottery to me. And I was just wondering, what's the actual impact on us? Because we're talking about 60 odd million pounds worth of budget issues here. And yet an awful lot of it is really not down to this room.
Sorry. So I can just come back on that very quickly in terms of that. So yeah, so you're right. So quite often, one of the things that we have, a process that we have in place is around growth funding for schools. So where schools are experiencing growth to meet basic need, we can provide funding for them to run additional classes. So we do that in consultation with Schools Forum, and we do that in consultation with a group of head teachers who support us in making those decisions. So obviously where we can, where there is a basic need in an area, which does mean that actually putting on a new class or half a class would be more beneficial to do so, that will be considered as part of that group, and additional funding given to schools so that they can operate those additional classes to support the pupils in their local area, which will then avoid those transport costs. I think when it starts getting down to 1 or 2 individual pupils, I think that's potentially where it starts getting slightly trickier, because obviously there's not those economies of scale for the school to be operating additional classes for those. But we are, as I say, there is a process in place where it's pupils to meet basic need that they can get additional funding to operate additional classes, which in turn would then reduce the need to transport those children out of area.
So just taking that through to the logical next step, if I can, what we're saying here is that instead of spending it in the transport base, it's actually being picked up as a cost elsewhere, but it's less because of what we're doing.
Yep, it's less. So it's actually a cost to the dedicated schools grant. So it's not a cost to core council funding. So the growth fund is an amount which is agreed by Schools Forum on an annual basis. It's retained and then allocated out to those schools who are seeing growth to meet basic need. So yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Help. Thank you. Councillor Goodliffe.
Thank you. Forgive me if it is here, but I can't see it. How much is the year outturn in terms of the deficit budgets that we hold for our maintained schools in county, please?
Bear with me. It is there, I think. It is Appendix 6 on page 205. Sorry. And so Appendix 6 on page 205 shows a breakdown. So if you look at the far right column, so you can see that there's now 38 schools in deficit as at March 2026, with a total cumulative deficit value of 6.76 million in terms of that. So that's the figure in that table, which shows the movement from last year to this in terms of both deficits and surplus balances and overall net balances, held by maintained schools.
And how much does that cost us in terms of debt interest or anything like that?
So all of the schools' budgets are pulled together, if you like, within the overall kind of council. So as you can see at the bottom line there is still a 6.33 million surplus balance across all of our maintained schools. So it doesn't cost us anything, but you could argue it's a kind of a lost opportunity cost because we're not seeing the interest for that in totality.
Thank you very much. Are there any other questions? Councillor Demery-Homan.
I'm just going to piggyback off that point. We're seeing quite a consistent reduction, about 3 million in the last 3 years, or 3 million per year in the last 3 years in our cumulative net balances. I mean, obviously that's quite alarming to, track that trend out to what would be its logical conclusion. Have you any words of assurance for us? Any plans to tackle this, please?
Yeah, so we're doing quite a lot of work at this on the moment, working with Sarah and colleagues in education, looking at the kind of those schools which are in deficit, both for historically and then going forward. We had a schools deficit monitoring group meeting last week where we ran through the budget submissions we've received to date this year to start looking at those at much more detail. We then have levels of intervention for schools who are in deficit with our finance support groups up to our finance intervention groups, where we work with those schools to kind of develop recovery plans to try and bring them out of deficit. So based on the information we've received so far for the budget submissions for this year, 4 of the schools that you see in this 38 have come out of deficit or are forecasting rather to come out of deficit in the current financial year. However, there are a further 5 which look as though they're going into deficit. So it's an ever-changing pattern based on the individual circumstances of the school. Not least, as I mentioned earlier, we're seeing falling rolls across the county, which is obviously having a significant impact because schools funding is primarily pupil led. So there is work which is going on there, and the intention is to kind of bring back regular updates as part of the finance monitoring report on the progress with those schools.
Thank you very much. Any other questions or comments? Thank you very much. We're being asked to note the report, so there isn't a vote on that. Thank you very much, Martin. The next item is the CYP Corporate Performance Report, Q4. And can I ask Martin? Oh, very good. Liz, very welcome. Have a seat. And would you like to just quickly introduce the Q4 report?
Absolutely. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. So this is the corporate performance report presented, which covers the strategic key performance indicators for the quarter 25-26 financial year from the 1st of January to the 31st of March. Obviously, it's in the format that you are all familiar with. So I was simply going to draw your attention, which I'm sure you have seen, to some of the highlights. That obviously we have 3 red indicators in this quarter. The 2-year-old, the take up of those eligible for 2-year-old funding for the 15-hour entitlement is red. However, you can see in the narrative as to kind of why that has been the case also for us and nationally, and where we kind of sit in that picture. So I thought the narrative does kind of explain why that has got some sort of challenge to us. In terms of the other reds, the placement stability for children in care, The target is 71% and it was 62.6%. I do have, obviously more detail if there were questions, but we have done quite a lot of work on that. We've done particular pieces around quality assurance and audit activity in relation to stability. From our quality assurance team, and we do continue to kind of sort of work in terms of how we recruit foster carers and how we work really closely with providers, with the clinical service and in terms of the support within the system. The other red indicator is the EHCP data. I know that's an improving picture in the data, and I do appreciate that there has been quite a lot of attention to that aspect overall this afternoon, so I'm not going to comment sort of further. I was going to again make an observation that a number of the indicators are exceeding the target kind of set. Both the child protection kind of sort of ones that relate to child protection are exceeding the target. And out of the 7 of the 14 that have a measures of performance that are cited as declining, 3 of those, 43%, still are exceeding the target that is set. So it's not to take away from the fact that we need to monitor that, but actually it's still sitting as an exceeding target in that sense. The in-house foster carer kind of information, I was simply going to alert to you point that whilst we were 51.9%, the target is 51%, but actually the April and the most recent data, we are 52.7%. So I appreciate that is outside the scope of the quarter presented, but again, to bring that assurance to you that we continue to see that sort of incrementally rising, which is absolutely what we want to see. Do you have any questions?
Thank you very much. And just to note that there is a review of performance indicators and targets taking place in the first half of this financial year that we have just started. And it's following the strategic framework refresh that maybe you are aware of. And so please ask questions, but also make recommendations for any changes to indicators that are there, or any new ones you would like to add, or any ones that you think perhaps are not needed anymore. So, Councillor Goodliffe, do you want to ask a question first?
Thank you. It's indicator 006. I've not managed to do 007 this time round, sorry. Now, I recognise that obviously our percentage of children or young people not in education, employment or training is better than statistical neighbours, but it's still sitting at 4%. Could we possibly have some more information, if not today, then via a report, of how much we do to try and contact those young people and get in touch with them and let them know what is around them? I know there's talk about the trailblazer work, but it'd be really good to know more, I think, as a committee.
Yes. So yes, we can do that. There's a really robust annual report that is produced by Mark Cowdell, who leads in this area. And there's also the new, the Milburn report. So there's a report going scheduled for COSMIC, which will look at having a much more cross-directorate support around NEET. So we've definitely got an opportunity, I think, to look in a more joined up way at supporting young people at risk of NEET. But also there's the indicator that I mentioned earlier around vulnerable children. So yes, in short, we will provide a briefing note on that.
Thank you, Councillor Tong.
Sorry, while we're on this topic of CYP006, which is the NEET indicator, firstly, can I say I absolutely share the same beliefs. I think it's really, really important we are doing as much as we can to try and tackle this issue. I assume a lot of people in this room might have had a bit of a read of the Milburn report, which was published last month, I think, at this point, and it really shows the depth of the issues with youth unemployment in the UK. We're largely protected here in Cambridge, which is good, but I think it's still something we can work a lot harder on. This is a bit of a pedantic, detaily question. I may be missing it somewhere. So on the 9th page of this section, there is a graphing that shows the percentage of young people 16 to 18 who are NEET or not known I was wondering if it might be useful if at some point we had the stats of just the raw numbers of people we know are NEETs, because factoring the people that are not known could potentially throw that off quite highly, or at least specify by month how many people are not known, because if there was an issue with data gathering, it could skew the figures quite greatly. Sorry, that's a little bit of a geeky detail, but something I think might be helpful for our monitoring of this situation, which I think is something we need to pay more attention to going forward.
I don't think it's a geeky question at all, because I think actually if it's not known, sometimes that about the schools not sharing the destination data. So it's not necessarily as big a risk. It's more a data collation exercise than a risk of, are these children not in education, employment or training? So absolutely, we can include that within that briefing note.
Thank you. Any other questions or suggestions? Councillor Edge.
Thank you. I just wanted to go to KPI 18, which continues to increase. Do we have more data on the instances? I'm particularly interested in those within that group that may be awaiting EHCPs, and how we're monitoring these children where they're not in education, particularly consideration of safeguarding.
Yeah, so this is the indicator with reference to children who are electively home educated. And I think if I'm understanding your question, Councillor Edge, it's about the profile of young people and the level of risk attached to that. So there is a new statutory requirement for the local authority to have a risk of vulnerable children register. So children who are not in school. So we are developing that with our virtual school, with our lead for NEETs, and also with our lead for targeted support alongside school improvement, so that we can rigorously interrogate the level of risk within our elective home education educated children. And obviously we have to accept also that just because somebody is electively home educated does not put them at risk. It is a parental choice. However, as you rightly challenge, we need to reassure ourselves that those children are accessing education and there isn't heightened risk associated with other factors. So that piece of work will look at who are the children who are missing education, who are out of education, either because they're electively home educated, because they might be waiting for a specialist placement, or because they are accessing alternative provision, but perhaps are on part-time timetables. So there is a big piece of collaborative piece of work looking at that to ensure that we have got a multi-agency response to managing that need.
Thank you very much. Any other questions or suggestions? No. Thank you very much indeed. And we're asked to note the report. Moving on to the last item on the agenda, we've got the committee agenda plan, training plan and appointments. So may I ask, are there any further updates to the agenda plan? No. Are there any comments from members on the training plan? Councillor Goldsack.
Well, not so much the training plan, but the agendas, really. We've seen our officers today with so much on their plate. I'm reluctant to put more on it, but we now are not scheduled to meet again now until the 20th of October. It's a long while without having a handle of what's going on and where are we at and what are we doing. I mean, the officers will probably welcome it, bless them, but I know we've got the reserve date in September, but it just feels too long for me. It doesn't feel right. And I think, Chair, you've used the word quite a few times today. We're here to scrutinise and understand and support. And we're not given a chance to do that if we're meeting in June and then not again for 4 months later. A third of the year is a long, long while.
Would you like to?
Sorry, Chair. I was just going to say I think we have talked about this a little bit in spokes as well. Not last time, the time before. I completely agree that we actually need to kind of look at how we can spread things out. I think there was something around kind of how things have historically fitted in, but I think we do need to look at that pattern to make sure that we don't have that big break. I'd agree with you on that.
Can we take that as an action to
Absolutely.
contemplate? Because it may be that there is something that allows us to do some scrutiny and have updates in September and perhaps around the reserve date, but which does not involve a full committee meeting with papers. If that makes sense, but let us discuss that and come back to spokes. Thank you. That's a really important point, because we have had a year where we've had committee meetings month after month after month, and then suddenly there's a gap. I appreciate that. In terms of, are there any other comments about the training plan? No, or the agenda. So the only other comment to make is that Councillor Dupre is going to be our representative, is proposed to be our representative to SACRE. And we have one vacancy on SACRE left. If a member, I'm looking particularly at the members on this side of the room, if anyone would like to volunteer, that would be, if you would like to think about that. Johnny.
Sorry, can I just add, Councillor Dupre's being added. There are already 2 other members of the CYP that are on SACRE. I think when we looked at the terms of conditions for SACRE, it did suggest that it should be, as much as possible, it should be an all-party representation. So that's why I think we're kind of mentioning that it would be really good to have somebody on the other side.
If not for answering now, if you could have a think about that, that'd be helpful. Unless anyone has any burning issues to raise right now, that brings us to the end of today's business. And we will next meet on the 20th of October, or possibly before. And I declare this meeting closed.